They laughed in my face on my own birthday. They thought I was just a failure living in delusion. But one phone call was enough to bury all their mockery and make them tremble when they realized who truly controlled their fate. Tonight, at this elegant Chicago restaurant, surrounded by my family's sneering faces, I held the power to destroy everything they'd built their arrogance upon. They had no idea the quiet daughter they'd dismissed for 34 years now owned their world. My name is Natalie Moore, and tonight marked 34 years of existence that my family seemed determined to treat as 34 years of disappointment. The Meridian Club overlooking Lake Michigan had always been Dad's choice for important family discussions, the kind of place where crystal glasses caught the city lights and conversations were conducted in hushed, civilized tones that somehow made every criticism sound reasonable. I should have known this birthday dinner wouldn't be about celebration when I saw the seating arrangement Mom and Dad flanking me like prosecutors. My sister Laura and brother Daniel positioned across the table like a jury. "Natalie," Dad began, setting down his scotch with the same deliberate precision he used in boardroom presentations. "Your mother and I have been discussing your situation." Richard Moore had perfected the art of making every word sound like a diagnosis. At 62, he commanded Harrison Dynamics with the kind of old-school authority that made CEOs half his age seek his approval. Tonight, that same tone was dissecting his daughter's life with surgical precision. "Ooh, we're concerned," Mom added, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy she'd honed through decades of charity luncheons. Helen Moore knew exactly how to deliver devastating news while appearing compassionate. "You're 34 now, sweetheart. It's time to face reality." Laura leaned forward, her surgeon's hands folded neatly on the white tablecloth. Even at dinner, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who saved lives before most people finished their morning coffee. "We're just worried about your future. Nat, this whole tech consulting thing, it's been 7 years now." "7 years of what, exactly?" Daniel chimed in, loosening his tie with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never lost a case. "I mean, what do you actually do? You say you help companies with their technology, but you work from that tiny apartment. You never talk about clients. You drive a car older than my law school diploma." The irony wasn't lost on me. Here sat my family a surgeon, a corporate lawyer, and a business magnate united in their assessment of my failures, completely oblivious to the fact that I was probably the only person at this table who understood what real wealth looked like. "At your age, I was managing 300 employees," Dad continued, his voice gaining momentum. "I had a corner office, a clear trajectory, respect from my peers. You're living like a college student playing at entrepreneurship." I took a sip of wine, tasting the bitter irony more than the vintage. They wanted respect trajectory. I could have bought this restaurant, the building it sat in, and probably the entire block with what I'd made in the last quarter alone. But that wasn't the game we were playing tonight. "Maybe it's time to consider other options," Mom suggested gently. "Your father knows people. Harrison Dynamics has an excellent IT department. The work might be more structured than what you're used to, but at least it would be stable." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from Dad's Cuban cigars, expensive, suffocating, and impossible to ignore. I watched their faces, each one wearing that expression of patient concern reserved for family interventions and terminal diagnoses. Laura reached across the table, her manicured fingers briefly touching my hand. "We're not trying to hurt you, Natalie. We just want to see you succeed, really succeed, not just whatever this is you're doing." "This is about legacy," Daniel added, swirling his wine with practiced sophistication. "Look around this table. We've all built something meaningful. Laura saves lives every day. I fight for justice. Dad built Harrison Dynamics from nothing into one of the most respected manufacturing companies in the Midwest. What are you contributing?" The question hit exactly as intended, a precision strike designed to make me question everything I'd built while they weren't paying attention. For 7 years, I'd listened to variations of this conversation. 7 years of patient smiles while they compared my mysterious work to their concrete achievements. 7 years of being the family disappointment while secretly building an empire they couldn't even imagine. "I think," Dad said, setting down his glass with finality, "it's time for an honest conversation about your future, because this fantasy you're living in, it needs to end." The waiter approached to refill our wine glasses, and I used the interruption to study my family's faces. They sat there with such certainty, such absolute conviction in their assessment of my life. Not one of them had ever asked the right questions. Not one had wondered how I afforded my apartment, my travels, my apparent lack of financial stress. They'd constructed an entire narrative about my failures without bothering to investigate the reality. Tonight, that willful blindness was about to cost them everything. The pattern had been set long before tonight. As I sat there listening to their latest assessment of my failures, my mind drifted back to the foundation of every wound they'd inflicted over the years. I was 12 when I first told them I wanted to start a business. While other kids played video games, I'd been teaching myself basic programming and selling simple websites to local shops for $50 each. When I excitedly showed Dad my first check, he'd patted my head and said, "That's nice, sweetheart, but real business requires real experience." High school brought more ambitious projects. I'd built a small network helping classmates with their computer problems, charging $20 per fix. Laura, already planning her pre-med track, had rolled her eyes at dinner one night. "It's cute that Natalie thinks she's going to be some kind of tech person, but let's be realistic about her academic limitations." The words had stung then, especially coming from my older sister who I'd once idolized, but it was nothing compared to what came later. College was where the real dismissal began. While studying computer science at Northwestern, I'd started freelancing for local businesses, building their websites and managing their basic IT needs. By junior year, I was pulling in more money than most of my professors made. When I mentioned potentially dropping out to focus on my growing client base, the family reaction had been swift and brutal. "Absolutely not," Dad had declared during a tense Thanksgiving dinner. "No daughter of mine is throwing away her education for some hobby." He'd used the word hobby like it was something distasteful he'd found on his shoe. Mom had been gentler but no less devastating. "Sweetheart, you're obviously talented with computers, but that's not a career for a young woman. It's a man's field, and you'll get eaten alive. Finish your degree, find something stable." Daniel, already in his second year of law school, had been characteristically blunt. "Nat, you're living in a fantasy. Real businesses have offices, employees, infrastructure. You're basically a really expensive babysitter for people who can't figure out their email." I'd graduated, as demanded, but I'd never stopped building. While they celebrated my diploma, I was quietly expanding my client network, developing more sophisticated solutions, learning the language of real business while they assumed I was simply delaying the inevitable acceptance of a real job. The moment I announced I was starting my own company at 27 had triggered what Mom called the intervention. They'd gathered me at this very restaurant, coincidentally, and spent 3 hours explaining why entrepreneurship was a young man's game, why the tech industry was too volatile, why I needed to think practically about my future. "Look at the statistics," Laura had insisted, armed with printouts she'd researched specifically for the occasion. 90% of startups fail within the first 5 years. You don't have a business plan. You don't have funding. You don't have experience managing people. This isn't realistic. I could get you an interview at Harrison Dynamics. Dad had offered the same offer he'd made again tonight. Good benefits, steady pay, room for advancement if you apply yourself. Stop chasing these pipe dreams and build a real foundation. But the worst part hadn't been their doubt. It had been their absolute certainty that they knew better. Every family gathering became an opportunity to check on my little project, as Mom called it. Every holiday dinner included subtle questions about when I'd be ready to settle down into something stable. They'd never asked to see my work, never inquired about my clients or my revenue. never wondered why I seemed financially comfortable despite their assumptions about my failures. They'd built an entire narrative about my life based on their preconceptions and had never bothered to investigate whether their story matched reality. When I bought my apartment 3 years ago, a beautiful 2-bedroom in Lincoln Park that cost more than Daniel made in 2 years, they'd assumed I'd gotten lucky with some kind of inheritance or settlement. When I traveled to conferences in San Francisco, London, and Tokyo, they'd figured I was living beyond my means, probably accumulating debt that would eventually catch up with me. The irony was that their dismissal had become my greatest asset. While they'd spent years preparing for the moment I'd come crawling back for help, I'd been quietly building something they couldn't comprehend. Their underestimation had given me the perfect cover to work without interference, to make mistakes and recover without judgment, to grow into something powerful while they looked the other way. Every family gathering had reinforced their certainty about my limitations. Every success I achieved was either ignored or diminished. When I'd mentioned landing a particularly significant client last Christmas, Daniel had asked if it was one of those pyramid scheme things, and Laura had wondered aloud if I was getting involved with something legally questionable. They'd never considered that maybe. Just maybe. They'd been wrong about me from the beginning. They'd never entertained the possibility that their quiet, underestimated daughter might have been building something extraordinary while they focused on their own achievements. Tonight, sitting at this table where they'd delivered so many verdicts about my failures, I realized that their willful blindness was about to become their undoing. 7 years of their certainty about my limitations had given me 7 years to prove them catastrophically wrong. The foundation for tonight's revelation had been laid in every dismissive comment, every patronizing suggestion, every assumption they'd made about my capabilities. They'd taught me the power of being underestimated, and I'd learned the lesson better than they could have ever imagined. The main course arrived with impeccable timing, giving my family fresh ammunition for their assault on my life choices. Laura cut into her salmon with surgical precision, each movement deliberate and controlled, much like the way she was about to dissect my career. "You know what I told my colleagues about you last week," she began, that familiar sweet tone that always preceded her cruelest observations. "Dr. Martinez was asking about family, and I mentioned I had a sister in tech. He assumed you worked for Google or Microsoft, someplace respectable. I had to explain that you're more like, well, IT support for small businesses." She delivered the comparison with a practiced smile, the kind she used when delivering terminal diagnoses to patients' families. "It's essentially the same skill set as the technicians who fix our hospital computers. Nothing wrong with that work, of course. But let's not pretend it's the same as actual entrepreneurship." Daniel laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut through the restaurant's ambient conversation. "It's support that's perfect. Remember when she used to fix our computers growing up, same energy, just with fancier terminology now." "The issue," Dad interjected, pausing to appreciate his perfectly cooked steak, "is the lack of scalability. You can't build a real business doing technical odd jobs. There's no infrastructure, no growth potential, no real value creation." Mom nodded sympathetically, reaching across to pat my hand. "We're not trying to diminish what you do, sweetheart, but after 7 years, shouldn't there be something more concrete to show for it? A real office employees, some kind of measurable success." I took another sip of wine, marveling at how confidently they discussed an industry they understood about as well as I understood neurosurgery. The irony was delicious. Here they sat, lecturing me about scalability and value creation while completely missing the fact that I'd scaled beyond anything their conventional minds could grasp. What's your actual annual revenue?" Daniel pressed, leaning forward with the predatory instinct of a lawyer who sensed weakness. "Not what you hope to make or what you might earn someday. What did you actually net last year?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could have told them the truth that my little tech consulting business had generated more revenue in the previous quarter than Dad's precious Harrison Dynamics made in 6 months. Instead, I simply smiled and said, "Enough." "Enough," Laura scoffed. That's not an answer. That's what people say when they're embarrassed about the real number. Or when they're living in denial, Daniel added. Look, Nat, we've all been where you are. That phase where you're convinced you're building something revolutionary when really you're just afraid to admit you need help. Dad set down his knife and fork with the finality of a judge reaching a verdict. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to call Jim Patterson tomorrow morning. He runs the IT division at Harrison Dynamics, and they're always looking for competent technicians. The starting salary is $65,000. Full benefits, clear advancement opportunities. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts with the satisfaction of a problem solver. Jim owes me favors going back 15 years. One call from me, and you'll have an interview by Wednesday. A real job with a real future. Richard's being generous, Mom added quickly. Most people would have to work their way up to that kind of opportunity. Your father's reputation is opening doors for you. The condescension was so thick I could taste it. Here sat my father, whose company I'd been quietly acquiring pieces of for the past 18 months, offering to help me get an entry-level position in his IT department. The cosmic humor of the situation was almost too perfect. Think about it practically, Laura continued, warming to her theme. You're 34. If you want a family someday, you need stability. You need health insurance that doesn't come from some marketplace plan. You need a retirement account, not whatever fantasy investment strategy you're currently pursuing. Plus, Daniel added with the cruel precision that made him dangerous in courtrooms, how long can you really keep living like a college student? The apartment, the old car, the mysterious income sources, it's not sustainable. At some point, reality has to catch up. Dad leaned back in his chair, assuming the posture of a CEO delivering a strategic assessment. I've spent 30 years building Harrison Dynamics into what it is today. I know what real success looks like, and I know what delusion looks like. What you're doing, sweetheart, is closer to the latter. We just want to see you settled, Mom said, her voice carrying the weight of maternal concern. All of us have built something meaningful. Your father has his company. Laura saves lives every day. Daniel fights for justice. We want you to have that same sense of purpose and accomplishment. The waiter appeared to clear our plates, and I noticed how my family automatically adjusted their posture, becoming more gracious and polite to the service staff while maintaining their casual cruelty toward me. It was a perfect microcosm of their worldview: respect for strangers doing their jobs, contempt for family members who didn't meet their standards. The offer stands, Dad concluded as the table was cleared. One phone call, and you can start building a real career. But I need an answer tonight. Jim's patience isn't unlimited, and neither is mine. They sat there looking at me expectantly. 3 successful professionals who had just delivered what they considered the ultimate act of family generosity. They'd diagnosed my problems, prescribed a solution, and were now waiting for my grateful acceptance of their intervention. I could feel my phone vibrating in my purse, probably Jessica calling with updates on the Harrison acquisition. The timing was almost poetic. While Dad sat here offering to get me an entry-level job at his company, my assistant was likely calling to confirm that his company now belonged to me. The beautiful irony was that they'd never see it coming. My phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. The vibration against my leg felt like a countdown timer, marking the seconds until everything changed. I glanced at the screen briefly. Jessica's name appeared alongside the time, 9:47 p.m. Phone away during dinner, Dad commanded, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he used in boardrooms. This is exactly what I'm talking about. No boundaries, no professional discipline. When I'm with family, business waits. The irony of his statement wasn't lost on me. Richard Moore, who had taken calls during every family vacation, every holiday dinner, every birthday celebration throughout my childhood, was now lecturing me about work-life balance. The man who had taught me that important calls always took priority was suddenly concerned about dinner etiquette. It might be important, I said quietly, my thumb hovering over the answer button. Laura shook her head with practiced disapproval. See, this is what happens when you don't have proper employment structure. Real professionals know when to disconnect. Unless you're literally saving lives, Daniel added with a smirk. Nothing is so urgent it can't wait an hour. The phone stopped buzzing, then immediately started again. Jessica wouldn't call twice unless something significant had happened. She knew I was with family tonight, knew how important it was to maintain the facade until the right moment. For her to call again meant the timeline had accelerated. Seriously, Natalie, Mom said, her voice taking on that edge of maternal authority that had made me clean my room and finish my vegetables for 18 years. Put it away. We're trying to have an important conversation about your future. I stared at the screen, watching Jessica's name flash with urgent persistence. This was the call I'd been waiting for, the confirmation that 18 months of careful planning, strategic acquisitions, and patient maneuvering had finally reached its conclusion. The call that would transform tonight from a family intervention into something far more satisfying. But Dad's expression had hardened into the look that had terrified me as a child, the look that meant consequences for disobedience, that meant disappointment that would linger for weeks. Even at 34, some reflexes died hard. If you answer that phone, he said slowly, this conversation is over. The job offer disappears, and you can figure out your life without our help. The ultimatum hung in the air like a challenge. Around us, other diners continued their civilized conversations, their quiet celebrations, their normal family dynamics. None of them knew they were witnessing the exact moment when 34 years of family hierarchy was about to implode. Jessica's call went to voicemail, and immediately the phone buzzed with a text message. Even without reading it, I knew what it would say. The deal was done. Harrison Dynamics. Dad's life's work, his legacy, his source of pride and identity was mine. The phone started ringing again. Answer it, I said to myself, though the words felt like stepping off a cliff. Excuse me, Dad's eyebrows shot up in surprise. I said answer it. This time I spoke aloud, my voice steadier than I felt. Some things can't wait. Before anyone could protest further, I swiped to accept the call and lifted the phone to my ear. Jessica. Natalie, thank God. My assistant's voice was breathless with excitement and exhaustion. She'd been working around the clock for the past 72 hours to finalize the acquisition. I'm sorry to interrupt your dinner, but I couldn't wait. It's official. The restaurant noise faded into background static as her words hit me. Around the table, my family watched with varying degrees of annoyance and curiosity. Dad's jaw was set in the rigid line that meant I'd crossed a boundary I couldn't uncross. Tell me, I said quietly, turning slightly away from the table but not enough to hide the conversation entirely. Harrison Dynamics is ours. The board voted unanimously 20 minutes ago. $3.5 billion. Exactly as we discussed. The subsidiary integration will be complete by tomorrow morning, and all existing management contracts transfer to more technologies effective immediately. The words washed over me like vindication made audible. $3.5 billion. The number represented more than money. It represented the complete reversal of every assumption my family had made about my capabilities, my worth, my place in their hierarchy. Any complications? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Jessica was too thorough for complications. None. Legal cleared everything this afternoon, and the financing came through exactly on schedule. Oh, and Natalie, the Harrison board specifically requested to meet with you tomorrow at 10 a.m. They're eager to understand the transition timeline. I could hear the smile in her voice. Jessica knew exactly what this moment meant, knew how long I'd been building toward this conversation. She'd been with me for 3 years, had watched me plan every move, every acquisition, every strategic decision that led to tonight. Schedule it, I said, and Jessica, excellent work. Should I prepare the integration memo for tomorrow? Yes, full organizational chart, management structure, everything. I want complete transparency about who reports to whom going forward. Dad was staring at me now with something between confusion and concern. The conversation was clearly more substantial than he'd expected, and my tone was carrying an authority he'd never heard from me before. "One more thing," Jessica added. "The press release goes out at 6 a.m. tomorrow. Are you ready for that level of visibility?" I looked around the table at my family dad with his growing bewilderment, Mom with her polite confusion, Laura and Daniel exchanging glances that suggested they thought I was performing some elaborate charade. "I'm ready," I said. "Perfect. Congratulations. Natalie, you just became one of the most powerful people in Chicago." I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. 4 pairs of eyes stared at me with expressions ranging from irritation to curiosity to something that might have been the first stirrings of concern. "Well," Dad said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger, "I hope that was worth interrupting our family discussion." I smiled, feeling the weight of Jessica's words settling over me like armor. "Actually, Dad, I think it was exactly what this family discussion needed." I slipped my phone back into my purse and returned my attention to the table, where 4 faces stared at me with varying degrees of disapproval. The conversation I'd just finished hung in the air between us like smoke, but they had no idea they'd just witnessed the moment their entire world shifted on its axis. "As I was saying," Dad resumed, his voice carrying that edge of irritation reserved for employees who'd tested his patience. "This is exactly the kind of unprofessional behavior that concerns us. You can't just take calls during important family conversations." I nodded politely, studying his face with new eyes. Richard Moore, the man who had built Harrison Dynamics from a small manufacturing shop into a regional powerhouse, had no idea he was now speaking to his new boss. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. "You're absolutely right, Dad," I said, my voice calm and measured. "Professional boundaries are important." Laura leaned forward, apparently emboldened by what she perceived as my capitulation. "See, when you work for a real company, you learn to prioritize. Nobody at the hospital would dream of taking personal calls during a procedure." "Speaking of real companies," Daniel added, swirling his wine with practiced sophistication, "what was that conversation about? It sounded almost corporate." The opening was too perfect to ignore. I could see the curiosity in their eyes, the slight confusion about why a simple tech support call would involve terms like acquisition and board votes. They were starting to sense that something didn't quite fit their narrative about my failures. "Oh, just business," I said casually, watching as Mom straightened in her chair. "Business," she repeated, her voice carrying that tone of maternal concern mixed with skepticism. "Sweetheart, that sounded like more than just fixing someone's computer problems." Dad was studying me now with the same intensity he brought to contract negotiations. 30 years of reading people in boardrooms had given him instincts that were starting to ping warnings he couldn't quite identify. "The woman on the phone mentioned billions," he said slowly. "That's not typical IT consulting vocabulary." I felt a cold smile playing at the corners of my mouth. They were finally starting to ask the right questions. 7 years too late. All those family gatherings where they'd dismissed my work without investigation. All those assumptions about my limitations based on their preconceptions, the foundation of their certainty was beginning to crack. "You're very observant," I replied, taking a sip of wine and savoring both the vintage and the moment. "Though I suppose attention to detail is important in your line of work." What exactly is your line of work?" Laura asked, her surgeon's precision cutting straight to the heart of their confusion. "Because that conversation sounded like you were discussing some kind of major business transaction." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his lawyer's instincts engaged. "Natalie, what aren't you telling us that call wasn't about technical support for small businesses?" The questions were coming faster now, their comfortable assumptions giving way to genuine bewilderment. For the first time in years, they were looking at me, really looking, instead of seeing only their preconceived notions about my failures. "I think," Dad said carefully, his voice taking on the measured tone he used when extracting information from difficult negotiations. "We need to have a different conversation than the one we planned tonight." I watched them processing the disconnect between their expectations and what they'd just witnessed. The woman who took that call had spoken with authority, had made decisions involving numbers they associated with major corporations, had carried herself with a confidence that didn't match their image of their struggling daughter. "The integration memo," Mom said suddenly, her eyes widening slightly. "You mentioned an integration memo. That's corporate language. Natalie, that's merger and acquisition terminology." The pieces were starting to fall into place in their minds, creating a picture they weren't prepared to accept. I could see Dad's businessman instincts warring with his paternal assumptions, his need to understand a complex situation competing with his certainty about my limitations. "Who were you talking to?" he asked directly, abandoning the subtle approach. "And don't say it was just a client. That was your assistant. Wasn't it people don't have assistants unless they're running something substantial?" Laura and Daniel exchanged glances across the table, the same look they'd shared as children when they realized they'd misunderstood something important. The comfortable dynamic of the evening, the three successful siblings delivering wisdom to their disappointing sister, was dissolving into something none of them had anticipated. "The board meeting," Daniel said slowly, his legal mind parsing the conversation he'd overheard. "You mentioned a board meeting. Small businesses don't have boards. Nat, what kind of company has a board that votes on billion-dollar acquisitions?" I set down my wine glass and looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. They were finally asking the right questions, finally looking past their assumptions to examine the evidence in front of them. After 7 years of willful blindness, they were beginning to see. "The kind of company," I said quietly, "that you've been underestimating for a very long time." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable pauses that had punctuated their earlier lectures. This was the silence of people realizing they'd made a fundamental miscalculation, the quiet moment before a carefully constructed worldview collapsed entirely. Dad's hand tightened around his Scotch glass, and I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. 30 years of business experience was telling him one thing, while 34 years of paternal assumptions insisted on another. The cognitive dissonance was written across his face in lines of confusion and growing concern. "Natalie," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before, "what exactly have you built?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Dad's business instincts had finally overridden his paternal assumptions, and now he sat across from me with the focused intensity of a man who suspected he'd been played but couldn't yet see how. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, unlocking it with deliberate slowness. Every movement was calculated, designed to build the tension that had been 7 years in the making. They wanted to know what I'd built. It was time to show them. "Since you asked," I said, my voice carrying a new authority that made Daniel straighten in his chair, "I suppose it's time for some honesty." I opened the executive dashboard app on my phone, the one Jessica had custom designed to give me real-time access to every aspect of my business empire. The screen displayed numbers that would have made any of them dizzy, but I scrolled past the revenue figures and quarterly reports to find what I was really looking for. "More technologies," I said, turning the phone so they could see the corporate logo, elegant, professional, unmistakably serious. "That's what I built. Dad, that's my little tech consulting business." Laura leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "More technologies I've never heard of." You wouldn't have," I interrupted smoothly. "We've maintained a deliberately low profile, private company, selective client base, very discreet operations. But as of 23 minutes ago, we became significantly more visible." I swiped to the next screen, where the Harrison Dynamics logo now appeared as a subsidiary under the More Technologies umbrella. The visual was stark, undeniable, and absolutely devastating to everything they thought they knew about corporate hierarchy. What is this?" Dad's voice was barely above a whisper, his face draining of color as he stared at his company's logo positioned beneath mine. "This," I said, savoring each word like fine wine, "is the acquisition that Jessica called to confirm. Harrison Dynamics is now a wholly owned subsidiary of More Technologies, which means, Dad, that as of tonight, you work for me." The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was the sound of absolute shock, of worldviews crumbling, of 34 years of assumptions shattering like crystal hitting concrete. Mom's hand went to her throat, her eyes wide with disbelief. Laura's mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish gasping for air. Daniel sat frozen, his wine glass halfway to his lips, his lawyer's mind struggling to process the impossibility of what he was seeing. But it was Dad's reaction that satisfied me most. Richard Moore, the man who had built his identity around being the family's sole business success, stared at the screen with the expression of someone watching their entire world rearrange itself in real time. "That's impossible," he breathed. "Harrison Dynamics isn't for sale. The board would never—" "The board voted unanimously," I said, my voice steady and professional. $3.5 billion, all cash. Deal closed 23 minutes ago. I'm surprised Jim Patterson hasn't called you yet, but I suppose he's still in meetings with my transition team." I swiped to another screen, showing the detailed acquisition timeline. "We've been accumulating shares for 18 months. Dad, quiet purchases, strategic patience. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger disclosure requirements until we were ready to make our move." Daniel found his voice first, though it came out as a croak. "You bought Dad's company." "I acquired a strategic asset that perfectly complements our existing portfolio," I corrected. "Harrison Dynamics has excellent manufacturing capabilities and a solid client base. Under proper management, it should integrate seamlessly with our other holdings." Dad's face was cycling through emotions I'd never seen before: shock, disbelief, anger, and something that might have been fear. Other holdings. What other holdings? I smiled, enjoying the way the question revealed how little they'd bothered to learn about my actual work. "Would you like to see the full portfolio? It's quite impressive, if I do say so myself." I scrolled through screen after screen of corporate acquisitions, strategic investments, and subsidiary companies. Each swipe revealed another piece of the empire I'd built while they dismissed me as a failure. Manufacturing companies, tech firms, real estate holdings, venture capital investments, a diversified business portfolio that dwarfed anything they'd imagined possible. "This can't be real," Laura whispered, her surgeon's hands trembling slightly as she reached for her wine. You can't have been hiding this whole time." "I wasn't hiding," I replied calmly. "I was building. While you were all so certain about my limitations, I was proving you wrong one acquisition at a time. Every family dinner where you dismissed my work, every holiday where you offered career advice, every conversation where you assumed I was struggling, I was actually outgrowing anything you could comprehend." Dad leaned back in his chair, his face gray with shock. "The job offer. I offered to get you an entry-level position at your own subsidiary." "That was particularly ironic," I agreed, "though I appreciate the gesture. It's always nice when employees show initiative in trying to help management understand the organization." The word employees hit him like a physical blow. Richard Moore, who had spent 30 years building Harrison Dynamics, who had defined himself by his corporate success, was now my employee. The man who had lectured me about real business, real success, real achievement was now answerable to the daughter he'd dismissed as a dreamer. "I don't understand," Mom said, her voice small and confused. "If you've been this successful, why didn't you tell us? Why let us think you were struggling?" I looked around at the table at their stunned faces. These people who had spent 7 years so certain of my failures that they'd never bothered to investigate the reality. "Because," I said softly, "you never asked the right questions. You were so convinced you knew who I was that you never bothered to find out who I'd become." The restaurant continued its elegant buzz around us, other families enjoying their normal dinners, unaware that at our table, everything had just changed forever. Dad's hands were shaking now, barely perceptible tremors that he tried to hide by gripping his Scotch glass tighter. The color had drained from his face completely, leaving him looking older than I'd ever seen him. This was a man who had spent 30 years commanding boardrooms, making decisions that affected hundreds of lives, building his identity around being the ultimate authority in any business discussion. Now he sat across from me, realizing that his life's work, everything he had built, everything he had achieved, everything he had used to define his worth, belonged to the daughter he had just been lecturing about her failures. 30 years, he whispered, more to himself than to anyone at the table. I built that company for 30 years. Shh, you built it very well, I said, my voice professional and measured. The operational efficiency is impressive, the client relationships are solid, and the manufacturing capabilities are exactly what more technologies needed to expand our industrial portfolio. It was an excellent strategic acquisition. The clinical language hit him like slaps. I was discussing his life's passion, his legacy, his identity, in the same tone he might use to evaluate a quarterly earnings report. Every word was designed to remind him that Harrison Dynamics was no longer his company. It was mine. Laura was staring at her hands, her surgeon's composure completely shattered. I told my colleagues you were IT support, she said hollowly. I told them you fixed computers for small businesses. Technically accurate, I replied. More technologies did start with IT consulting, though we've diversified considerably since then. Daniel set down his wine glass with the careful precision of someone whose world had just tilted sideways. The law firm I work for, Harrison Dynamics, is one of our clients. We've been negotiating their supplier contracts for months. I smiled. Those contracts are probably under review now as part of the integration process. Don't worry, I'm sure my legal team will honor any existing agreements your firm has with my company. The phrase, my company, landed like a physical blow. Daniel, who had built his career on representing successful businesses, was now realizing that one of his major clients was owned by the sister he'd been mocking for her lack of professional achievement. The board meeting tomorrow, Dad said suddenly, his voice cracking slightly. You said there's a board meeting at 10 a.m. Actually, it's a management transition meeting, I corrected. The board has already voted. Tomorrow is when we discuss operational changes, staffing decisions, and strategic direction going forward. He closed his eyes, and for a moment I saw not the intimidating business leader who had shaped my childhood, but a 62-year-old man watching his world collapse. My position. Will be discussed tomorrow, I said simply. Along with all other senior management roles, I'll need to evaluate the entire organizational structure to determine how best to integrate Harrison Dynamics into our broader corporate strategy. The words were devastating in their professional politeness. I wasn't firing him yet, but I was making it clear that his continued employment was entirely at my discretion. The man who had offered to get me an entry-level job was now hoping I wouldn't eliminate his position entirely. Mom looked around the table with the bewildered expression of someone who had walked into the wrong movie. I don't understand any of this. How is this possible? You're our daughter. You live in that little apartment. You drive that old car. The apartment is in Lincoln Park and cost $800,000, I said calmly. The car is a restored 1967 Mustang that I bought because I like classic vehicles, not because I can't afford newer ones. You assumed I was struggling because that narrative fit your preconceptions. I pulled up another screen on my phone, showing the real estate portfolio. Actually, the Lincoln Park place is just my primary residence. There's also the house in Aspen, the condo in Manhattan, and a rather nice place in Napa Valley that I use for client entertainment. Each revelation hit them like a separate blow. Laura actually laughed a harsh, disbelieving sound that carried no humor whatsoever. This is insane, she said. You've been sitting here letting us lecture you about failure and responsibility and professional success, and the whole time you were, She gestured helplessly at my phone. What are you worth, Natalie? What is all of this actually worth? The question hung in the air like a challenge. They wanted to know the scope of their miscalculation, needed to understand exactly how wrong they'd been about everything. Forbes will probably want to do a profile once the Harrison acquisition becomes public, I said thoughtfully. Based on current valuations, More Technologies is worth approximately $12.3 billion. Since I own it outright, I shrugged. The math isn't complicated. The number hit the table like a bomb. $12.3 billion. More money than they could process, more success than they could have imagined, more power than any of them had ever wielded. Dad was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. You're telling me that my daughter who I offered to help get a job, is worth more than $12 billion. Conservatively, I confirmed. The portfolio continues to appreciate, and we have several major acquisitions in development that should increase that figure significantly over the next quarter. Daniel laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the restaurant's refined atmosphere. I make $200,000 a year, and I thought I was successful. I thought I was the family success story. You are successful, I said, and meant it. Just not as successful as you assumed I wasn't. The distinction was important. This wasn't about diminishing their achievements. It was about revealing the magnitude of their assumptions about my failures. Every time, Dad said suddenly, his voice hollow with realization. Every family dinner, every holiday, every birthday we've been lecturing a billionaire about how to build a career. He looked up at me with eyes that held a mixture of awe, shame, and something approaching terror. What else don't we know about you, Natalie? What else have we been wrong about? The question carried the weight of 34 years of family dynamics, 7 years of dismissive assumptions, and 1 night of revelations that had shattered everything they thought they understood about their place in the world. The question settled over our table like dust after an explosion. Dad sat there, his face a roadmap of everything he was beginning to understand about the scope of his miscalculations. The successful businessman who had built his identity around reading people and situations was confronting the reality that he had fundamentally misread his own daughter for 7 years. What else? I repeated softly, considering his question with the same deliberation I brought to major business decisions. You want to know what else you've been wrong about? I leaned back in my chair, studying the 4 faces around me, each one a portrait of shock, confusion, and dawning comprehension. These people who had spent the evening diagnosing my failures were now realizing they'd been performing surgery on a perfectly healthy patient while missing their own terminal conditions. You've been wrong about everything, I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent years building power while being underestimated. You were wrong about my capabilities, wrong about my ambitions, wrong about my achievements, and most importantly, wrong about who holds the real power in this family. Dad's hands trembled as he reached for his scotch. How long? He asked, his voice barely audible. How long have you been this successful while you lectured me about reality, I finished, about 3 years. That's when More Technologies really took off, when we started making acquisitions that put us in the same league as the companies you've always respected. I paused, letting that timeline sink in. 3 years of family gatherings where they'd offered career advice to someone who was already more successful than they'd ever dreamed of becoming. The Harrison acquisition has been in planning for 18 months, I continued. Every family dinner where you talked about your company, every story you told about your business challenges, every piece of industry insight you shared, I was gathering intelligence on a target I intended to acquire. The words hit him like physical blows. Richard Moore, the man who prided himself on business acumen, realized he'd been unknowingly briefing his future owner on the company he was about to lose. You used us, Laura whispered, her surgeon's precision cutting straight to the heart of the matter. I listened. I corrected. There's a difference. You were so eager to demonstrate your superiority that you never noticed you were giving away strategic information to someone you'd dismissed as irrelevant. Daniel set down his wine glass with shaking hands. The job offer. When Dad offered to get you a position at Harrison Dynamics. I was already planning to own it, I said simply. Though I did appreciate the irony. There's something poetic about an employee offering to help his future boss find work. Dad closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something fundamental had changed in his expression. The authority, the confidence, the paternal certainty that had defined him for my entire life, it was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen before, fear. "Well, what happens now?" he asked, and the question carried the weight of a man who suddenly understood that his future was entirely in someone else's hands. I considered the question carefully, savoring the moment I'd been building toward for 7 years, the moment when the family hierarchy that had oppressed me since childhood finally inverted itself completely. "Now," I said, my voice calm and measured, "you learn what it feels like to have your fate decided by someone you underestimated." I stood up from the table, leaving my phone where they could still see the evidence of everything they'd missed. More technologies, Harrison Dynamics, $12.3 billion, the empire I'd built while they dismissed me as a dreamer. "The transition meeting is tomorrow at 10 a.m., I said, looking directly at Dad. "I suggest you arrive prepared to discuss your future role in my company. And Dad..." He looked up at me with eyes that held 30 years of authority, but now carried the uncertainty of a man whose world had just collapsed. "Don't be late," I said softly. "I have very high standards for my employees." I picked up my purse and walked away from the table, leaving them sitting in the ruins of their assumptions. Behind me, I could hear the silence, the absolute quiet of people whose entire understanding of reality had just been shattered. As I reached the restaurant's exit, I turned back for one final look. There they sat the surgeon, the lawyer, the business magnate, and the society matron, 4 people who had spent the evening explaining success to someone who had already achieved more than they could comprehend. The irony was perfect. They'd called this dinner to stage an intervention about my failures. Instead, they'd discovered that the daughter they'd dismissed as a disappointment now controlled their destinies. I stepped out into the Chicago night, breathing in the crisp air of a city where I was now one of the most powerful people in the room. Any room. Tomorrow. The press releases would go out. Tomorrow. The business world would learn about more technologies and its quiet, strategic acquisitions. But tonight belonged to me. Tonight was the moment when 7 years of patient planning, strategic thinking, and calculated silence had finally paid off in the most satisfying way possible. Justice, it turned out, was a dish best served at a family dinner. Sir, thank you for listening to this story of patience, power, and the sweet taste of vindication. I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what you thought about Natalie's calculated revenge. Please subscribe to our channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and let me know if you've ever experienced the satisfaction of proving your doubters spectacularly wrong. Your engagement helps us bring you more stories like this one,